Well, hello to all of my methodical researchers out there. Welcome to the Week 3 assignment tutorial. We're gonna have a great time. Now, tutorials like this one are your primary means of assessing your skills. So I'm counting on you to watch this carefully and compare it to your own work. And then, if you didn't do quite as well as you'd hoped, please contact me for help because I won't necessarily know that you're having trouble otherwise. Also, do keep in mind that I try to make these assignments pretty open-ended, so it's perfectly natural if your answers vary somewhat from mine. Try to focus more on how I arrived at the answers. It's the method, it's the process. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the Week 3 assignment, which covers using legal encyclopedias to get an overview of the law early in your research. Now, for all of my assignments, I recommend that you start by carefully reading through the problem a couple of times, perhaps taking notes and highlighting, depending on your style. Here, in this fact pattern, we have this tech company, Wiz, who has really been underperforming and providing poor service with many disruptions in its brand new contract with Elegant Representations. And when Elegant naturally complains about this, Wiz really just seems to take advantage of the whole situation by suggesting that it would provide this reliable service, but only if Elegant pays more than the bargain for price for this so-called upgraded premium plan. Now, this is all complicated a bit by the fact that this whole scenario unfolds in the midst of a pandemic, which Wiz, of course, uses to excuse its poor service, its poor performance. And that's our basic scenario. We've been asked to research the issue of whether Wiz might have violated the implied duty of good faith. Now, our first few questions here are just focused on basic planning, right? So, 1A, what's the area of law? Well, our fact pattern is pretty squarely focused on the contract, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Now, we do know that we are researching the implied duty of good faith. Now, if you weren't familiar with this particular duty, you might try just Googling it. It's totally fine to use credible information from the web as far as background info for basic questions like this. You're not going to cite it or anything like that, of course, but it can be pretty helpful. And if we look over our results here, they do seem to agree that it is a contract law concept, although the terminology seems to vary quite a bit. And we'll just kind of note that variation and put a pin in it for the moment. Next, 1B. What is our legal issue? Well, with this one, it actually just states it right in the problem. Did Wiz violate the implied duty of good faith? It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. The main thing here is that you need to pay attention to the call of the question. Now, there are probably 1,000 different legal theories that might apply to these facts, maybe even better than this implied duty of good faith, including other contract law concepts like force majeure, like repudiation. But the key here is that I have not asked you to research any of those issues. And if this were a midterm or even a final, you wouldn't get any points for researching them. So you need to focus on researching the legal issue that I'm asking you to research. So pay attention to what the question is asking you to do. Okay, question 1C. What is the jurisdiction? Well, this one is pretty straightforward because not only is our client in Georgia, but the contract itself explicitly specifies that Georgia law will indeed apply. So easy enough, right? Okay, 1D, what are the key facts? Now this question is much more open to interpretation. So your answers are probably going to be somewhat all over the place. Now I would say that the fact just of the time frame stands out. The contract was signed in early 2020, and then immediately Elegant Representations experienced service disruptions, poor connectivity, made it very tough for them to do business. And the fact that Elegant contacted Wiz for support, Wiz just blamed the coronavirus pandemic. And the fact that soon thereafter, when the Wiz sales team contacted Elegant, they strongly suggested that they needed to buy this quote-unquote upgrade to the expensive premium plan to fix those issues and get just reliable service. And the fact that this so-called upgrade cost nearly twice as much as what they bargained for, which was actually described in some detail in the contract, along with the services to be provided. And the fact that although those details are in the contract doesn't mention upgrades or the quality of the services at all. And you can see that our basic process here is that we're just pulling the facts that seem the most germane to this legal claim that we're researching, and we're breaking them down into chunks that are a little more manageable for our research process and a little easier for us to think about and classify. Now, right now, we don't know enough about the law to meaningfully evaluate these kind of chunked little facts we have here, or to place them into, useful categories, but they're sort of ready and waiting for us to actually use once we know more about the law. And especially when we get into researching cases. Okay, so question 2. We just want the best legal encyclopedia for researching this legal issue. We know it's a Georgia law issue, and we know that if a state-specific encyclopedia is available, we would usually prefer that over a national encyclopedia like AmJur. So there's really only one choice for the current law of our jurisdiction, and that is Georgia jurisprudence. Now, there are a number of different ways to find Georgia jurisprudence on Westlaw, but I'm just going to start with state materials. Then I'm going to choose Georgia. And then I'm just going to scroll on down to secondary sources. And here we are, Georgia jurisprudence, our old friend. Now for question 3, we actually need to use this source by locating the specific sections that give us an overview of our overall legal issue. And there are probably a million different strategies, but usually a straightforward approach is best. So first, I'm going to limit our search to this title on contracts here by clicking on that box. And if we limit the universe to be searched like I just did, we're just a lot less likely to be overwhelmed or confused by the results that we get. And with that limit plugged in, I'm just going to go ahead and search for our legal term, implied duty of good faith. We don't want to complicate things too much with the facts here, since we are really just looking for an overview of this legal issue. Now, our first result here, implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, seems pretty similar, right? But the terminology is somewhat different. Now, as we scroll down through our results, we can see that none of the results really have our exact phrasing. And in the law, there's just a lot of fuzzy language, and that's just something you kind of have to get used to. Now, as I'm going through these, it really does seem like that first result seems the most promising. But we do need to actually look over it to tell whether it's indeed as relevant as it maybe seems. So I'm going to open it up in a new tab here. Now, just skimming through it here, reading over the text, it seems like it's pretty on point. The terms duty and covenant seem to be used almost interchangeably, almost as rough synonyms for one another. And we do find that phrase, fair dealing and fair dealing is sometimes tacked on to the terminology. But if we just kind of look at the basic idea here, it really seems pretty applicable to our facts and pretty consonant with the task that we were given, especially when we take into account our Google search earlier. Now, we might also want to look at perhaps its legal dictionary, maybe do a little more Googling, just to verify that we're talking about the same idea. In real life, probably also just ask the supervising attorney, was this the issue that you wanted me to research? But after just reading over this section and really taking a little bit of time with it, that I, of course, haven't recorded for you here, I do feel fairly confident that it's the best fit in Georgia jurisprudence. Although I still might go ahead and flag that differing terminology is something I want to look into later just to see if it has any significance. A big part of legal research and of practicing law generally just has to do with managing uncertainty. And one helpful way of doing that is by making sure that you're aware of what you don't know or what you're somewhat unsure of. Okay, so question 3b here asks us where we are within the structure of our legal encyclopedia, and this is useful because internally the titles and chapters of Georgia jurisprudence are organized topically, and they form kind of a conceptual roadmap of the law that can help us discern sort of where our legal theory might be situated within the greater scheme of things. And we can find that table of contents / conceptual roadmap over here as always in the left sidebar. And learning to navigate the table of contents here, it does take a little practice, but it is an important skill, and it's also one that you really just have to learn by doing, by getting used to. I'm confident you'll get the hang of it pretty quickly because it's fairly intuitive once you fiddle around with it for a little bit. Now, our title is Business and Commercial Law Contract, and then our chapter here is the nature and requisites of contract. Subchapter is construction and effect. And the subchapter is rules of construction. And then the subchapter is implication. And here we go. Here's our section on implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing that we're looking at right over here. Now, as long as you got the overall, title, the overall topic, and, a couple of those, one or two of those subheadings, I think you're in good shape, but taken together, this does give us a pretty good sense of what this implied duty of good faith and fair dealing is all about. And, we can get that it seems to be a principle that's used when interpreting contracts. helpful to know, helpful to have as background as we think about this legal issue. Okay, so question 4A asks us to read over that section we found in Georgia jurisprudence and to start thinking about how it might apply to our facts. Now, our supervising attorney in the fact pattern specifically mentioned Wiz's opportunistic behavior, and maybe a good question to go ahead and ask here would be, how does that figure into the law? And if we didn't run into the word while we were reading through this encyclopedia article here, the word opportunistic or something along those lines, a control F search can be a pretty helpful way of just quickly finding something like this. If you can spell. And we see this phrase here, take opportunistic advantage. It actually seems to be mentioned a couple of times throughout this section of the encyclopedia. And, that seems like it is really in the same ballpark as, opportunistic behavior. It's just another way of saying the same thing. And as we kind of look at the way it's being used here, it basically looks like this idea of taking opportunistic advantage is incorporated into the definition of the implied duty of good faith. Now, does it apply? Well, here, opinions might differ. I do think there is at least the potential that it could apply, that it's at least worth looking at. First of all, there's just nothing in the contract that we know about that covers this scenario. We know the contract is fairly detailed about services and prices, doesn't include anything about the quality, doesn't mention upgrades. Second, when it signed the contract, did Elegant contemplate that Wiz would provide poor service and then offer to charge them more just to correct the problem? Yeah, they probably didn't, or they wouldn't have signed the contract at all. Now, notice that basically just what I'm doing here is I'm just taking this little statement of law that we have here about taking opportunistic advantage as a component of this implied contractual duty of good faith, and I'm applying it to our little fact pattern. I'm not necessarily asking for a lot of analysis here or for anything really in depth. I just want to make sure that you're actually thinking about the law and how it applies as you do your research, because that is really important. Okay, so question 4B. This asks us to use our legal encyclopedia to find a primary source, which of course matches up perfectly with the ultimate goal of legal research, to find these primary sources that we can cite in our legal arguments. Now, specifically, we want the primary source cited as authority for that proposition about taking opportunistic advantage. Here it is. And that's going to be easy for us to find since we have a footnote right here. And for basically every sentence in this article, we have a little footnote. And each footnote is going to contain the primary source that is authority for the associated sentence. And our footnote for this opportunistic advantage sentence here, well, that takes us to this case from the Georgia Court of Appeals. And we can see that the citation is extremely long, but we're not going to worry about that at all for the moment. We just want the primary source. We can open it up in a new tab and quickly glance at it, I suppose. Oh, that Martin versus Hamilton State Bank case. Okay, so question 4C it asks us to see if there's any newer law, perhaps by looking at the cumulative supplement in our legal encyclopedia. Now, this cumulative supplement here at the bottom, it essentially gives us recent developments in the law that haven't really been incorporated into the main article yet. It's important to look at these because we want to at least make sure that the law has not drastically changed. And of course, as we skim through them, especially with the benefit of that Control F search here, we can see another case that discusses this idea of taking opportunistic advantage. And it basically just states the law in the exact same way. So yeah, newer case, same idea. Of course, if we were really researching this, we would definitely want to, take note of this Brazil case and put it in our research plan so we can, come back to it later and see what it's all about. Finally, question 5. This question asks us to reevaluate our planning stages. This basically completes the circle for us. It completes this process of preliminary analysis that's so helpful to our research. And when you were doing this, you didn't know anything about preliminary analysis, but you were doing it anyway. Imagine that. Now, does what we learn change our framing of the legal issue? Now, your results might vary somewhat here, so don't worry if you didn't get the exact same results or the exact same phrasing. But the way that I, read the law that we found, our definition of the implied duty of good faith, or, rather this implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing that's analogous to the implied duty of good faith, perhaps. At least one definition of it requires us to ask, kind of two separate questions about, opportunistic behavior or taking opportunistic advantage of. The first question would be, did Wiz take opportunistic advantage in a way that could not have been contemplated at the time that the contract was drafted? And then the second question would be, was this behavior by Wiz explicitly resolved by the parties in the contract? So basically, it's kind of a two-part test. Now, if possible, this is what we want to do during preliminary analysis. We want to break our legal issue down into more manageable sub-issues for our research, whether it's a multi-part test with a couple of different questions like you see here, or maybe a series of elements or various factors that need to be weighed. It needs to be broken down so you can really efficiently research it, because there are only so many things that you can research at one time, and usually that number is like one thing at a time. Okay, so question 5b. What about our assessment of the facts? Well, how do our facts fit into the legal framework? That's the question, really. There's room for creativity here, and I wouldn't be surprised if the answers that you guys gave were extremely varied. But yeah, addressing that first sub-issue, we might argue that the level of detail in the contract regarding pricing and services really strongly suggests that the parties didn't contemplate a pricey upgrade as being required for reliable services. And that second sub-issue seems pretty straightforward to me. The contract in our fact pattern was silent on upgrades. It was silent on quality. So it did not expressly resolve, any issues that are related to upgrades in quality. Now, as far as facts, the pandemic really stands out as well, although I think it's hard to say where it fits. The law definitely focuses on the parties' expectations and what they contemplate, and nothing can revise expectations like a pandemic, trust me. So it seems potentially very important, but without some additional factual nuances or factual discussion in our secondary sources, or at least, some more in-depth analysis, it's hard to say, how, if at all, it would actually fit into that little two-part test about opportunistic taking advantage of or opportunistic behavior. There's also more law in that encyclopedia article and elsewhere in Georgia jurisprudence on, this implied duty of good faith that we would probably want to learn about, and it may just be a better fit somewhere else. That's a possibility. But for this topic, I definitely noticed that Georgia jurisprudence basically just gave us, kind of these verbal formulas that are used by courts without much commentary on how they work or on the types of fact patterns that create legal issues in this area of law. So, we might want to check out a treatise to get a better sense of how the law might apply to any possible effects the pandemic may have had on WIS's performance. Or it might be better treated as just a different legal issue altogether. But regardless, it is valuable to know what you don't know. And I think, this particular fact is one that you would want to make note of on your research plan for later follow-up. But yeah, that is the week 3 assignment. It was a challenging assignment. They're designed to be challenging and make you stretch a little bit. So, if you didn't match up your answers perfectly with what I got here, don't worry about that at all. As long as you get the basic process that you go through to research a problem like this, then I think you're in good shape. That's the most important thing. If you didn't do as well as you expected, please contact me and I'll definitely lend you a hand and get you up to full understanding. Or if you just had any questions about this assignment or any of the related content or about anything at all, please touch base with me and I'm happy to help you. All right, that's all I have for now. Until next time.